This is the Moral Science Podcast, and I'm your host, Amber Cazell. In this series, I get to interview experts in my favorite subject, the scientific study of human morality, virtues and vices, evolution of morals, the judgment-action gap, character development, the philosophy of morality, transcendent experiences, researchers' moral biases, cultural values, plus the obligatory trolley dilemma. We are going to talk about it all. In this episode, 5 scholars of morality talk about their observations of ethics during the coronavirus pandemic. These scholars include Bengt Brülde, an associate professor of practical philosophy at the University of Gothenburg and the University West in Sweden, where he studies well-being, bioethics, and business ethics. Bradford Cokelet, assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Kansas, where he researches comparative ethics, character, and agency. Debra Lieberman, associate professor of psychology at the University of Miami, where she uses principles of evolutionary biology to understand disgust and altruism. Richard Schweder, cultural anthropologist and professor of human development at the University of Chicago, where he studies a variety of topics, including multicultural ethical exchanges. And Liane Young, associate professor of psychology at Boston College, where she uses functional neuroimaging to understand moral judgment. Everybody, I am super excited to be here today with a lot of wonderful scholars, and I'm going to have each of them go around and introduce themselves in a minute here. But generally today we're going to be discussing morality in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're just going to have some fun and see what conversation emerges. It's going to be a little bit different flavor this time than we're used to on this podcast. So for now, we're going to go around in a circle and have each of the scholars introduce themselves. I'd like each of you to say your full name, what your title is at your university and in which department, a little bit about your research, and then just a couple of observations that you've noticed about morality during the pandemic that you would like to discuss today, potentially. All right, so let's go ahead and start with Bengt.
All right, I'm Bengt Brülde, and I'm a professor of practical philosophy in the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. I hope I don't have to defend the Swedish approach too much, even though I endorse it. My research covers a whole lot of topics, everything from climate ethics to public health ethics to, more personal things like happiness and suffering and love and friendship and good and meaningful aging and so many things. But in these corona times, what I think are the most interesting ethical questions are, first of all, the political questions, of course, what strategy to choose and how to measure success when it comes to choosing a strategy, and but also, more narrow questions of healthcare, like if intensive care cannot give everyone the proper treatment, who should be prioritized and how should resources be allocated and so on. But I'm also very interested in the individual ethical questions, like how we as individuals should act during this pandemic, whether it's always wrong to expose others to risk, and why is it wrong in that case to expose others to risk? Is it because for paternalistic reasons, or is it because we should save healthcare capacity and so on? Mm-hmm. Questions like that.
Wonderful, thank you so much. All right, Rick, could you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
I'm Rick Schweder. I'm a psychological anthropologist and cultural psychologist in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. For some decades, I've been doing work on comparative ethics and comparing moral judgments and the structure of those moral judgments in a Orthodox Hindu temple town on the east coast of India and in the United States. I've increasingly been studying cultural collisions that emerge when people migrate from the southern world, or the third world in quotes, into Western liberal democracies, where people often have bumper stickers that say celebrate diversity, but when they actually see the kind of diversity anthropologists have been studying for a long time, they don't really like it very much. And one of my projects is trying to develop a big tent view of our capacity for a robust cultural pluralism in Western liberal democracies, and to ask the question what forms of liberal thinking are or are not compatible with genuine cultural diversity. With regard to the current pandemic, there are lots of issues, and Bengt's actually mentioned some that interest me as well. I'd just make two observations. The first is, it's been interesting to me, fascinating to me, how hard it is to turn off the contagion instinct once you activate it. And the media and lots of other people have been very good at activating the contagion instinct. An example of this might be a walk I was taking with a bunch of friends in a woods where I'm sheltering. And one of my friends said to the group, "It's been so long since I've been able to hug anyone or touch anyone. I'm going to hug that tree." And I jokingly said, "Well, how do you know someone else didn't hug that tree 2 hours ago?" And that's all I had to say to inhibit her behavior. I mean, it was so powerful, she wasn't going near that tree, just imagining someone else had touched it. I also have learned that moral intuitions don't always serve us very well, which, to the extent we get into a discussion of the herd immunity concept, arises in that context, because I've come to feel that there is a first order set of moral judgments we make, very intuitive, like I'd rather be healthy than sick. But there's also a second order level that, if you reflectively get into, leads you to actually come to see how getting infected and recovering, if you are any one of the vast numbers of people in any population who can do that without serious illness, there actually is both not only a personal benefit, but a collective benefit. And could it even be seen as a kind of heroic sacrifice for the sake of those who are genuinely vulnerable? So I suppose we'll be getting into issues of that type as we go along.
All right, Brad, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Brad Cokelet. I'm a philosopher at University of Kansas in the US. And my research, I do stuff on the nature of moral virtue, different virtues, and models of what the virtues are and of virtue development. And so some of my work is looking at Eastern philosophy and comparing it with Western philosophy on those issues. And then I also work with psychologists and other philosophers trying to study how to measure and study virtue development and improve that. And I also do some stuff on whether moral arguments and studying moral philosophy impacts people's behavior and how moral they are. And yeah, I agree, all the things that have been brought up already, lots of interesting stuff, some of it I thought of and some I hadn't. I guess for me, in addition to the political and individual questions that were brought up earlier and questions about, say, trade-offs among various goods or values that politically and individually we're having to make, I'm interested in the impact on the shutdown and the way that's affecting different people in different classes and socioeconomic groups, but also not just right now, but moving forward. And so I guess for me, assuming that a less than Swedish model living in the US, that's interesting to me. So for example, there's a lot of evidence of increased domestic violence. A lot of kids are not getting the same types of education or attention from their parents. On the other hand, some people are having more time together and they might be having more healthy and intense family relationships or other sorts of relationships that may actually be good for them. So I'm sort of interested in how the shutdown is affecting these different groups, the moral significance of that. And I guess related to that, I'm interested in the long run. I've been interested in the idea that maybe we're going to emerge from this crisis. We'll have to think about the impact and the sacrifices that have sort of intentionally or not been made by the younger generation right now. And I'm interested in the moral implications of the decisions we're making now because of how they're going to impact people who are the kids who are going to rise the next generation.
Yeah. All right, Debra.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Lieberman. I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and right now I'm at the University of Miami in the Department of Psychology. I'm really glad to be part of this conversation. For a long time, I've been interested in kinship, and my earlier work focused on how we figure out who our relatives are and how those systems that guide our own ideas about the family influence our moral views about family relationships. I've moved to other social relationships and emotions involved in maintaining those. So I've been interested a lot in gratitude and how that helps jumpstart important non-zero sum types of relationships. But perhaps more pertinent to this conversation, I'm interested in disgust. And so I've been interested in how disgust influences morality and law. And so I've been trying to understand disgust as an adaptation that guides three different things: our desire to contact other things, to eat things, and helps us and guides decisions in the sexual realm. And so my main interest during this particular time is obviously in how disease affects our physical distancing and ways that we can improve perhaps the public's understanding of why distancing is important and how that relates to disease and contamination and contagion. But perhaps more so, I'm concerned about how disgust so easily infiltrates our moral views, that this heightened sense of disgust that we're all walking around with now, and how easy it is, as Rick said, to kind of get people to think about disgust and contagion. My concern is about how easy it is then for moral norms that result from our disgust psychology, how easy those might be to spread and to become a bonfire. So I do share some concerns about how disgust infiltrates our morality. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And Liane.
Hi, I'm Liane Young. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Boston College. I have been really interested in moral psychology, both from a philosophical and psychological perspective. For a while, our lab has looked at the role of theory of mind, how we think about others' minds, others' mental states, beliefs, values, desires, and the impact that has on how people make moral decisions for themselves and how they evaluate others. We've also been very interested in how people make moral and social judgments across different contexts for different kinds of values, like harm and also purity, which Deb just mentioned, and also cooperative versus competitive contexts. More recently, we have been interested in how people form impressions of others and how people update their impressions of others depending on social context and social relationship. We've also been interested in the link between people's intuitions about different kinds of social obligations and their moral judgments of others' behavior as well. So with respect to the pandemic, I want to echo a lot of what's been said in terms of finding connections between purity and contagion and disgust issues, and also moral trade-offs, whether that's trade-offs between moral values and material values, or just trade-offs between different kinds of moral values, as I mentioned before, with harm and purity being one set of example values that could come into attention. I've also really been interested in the hero narrative surrounding healthcare workers and how that could potentially be damaging in certain respects. And like what's been mentioned before, I've been interested in just thinking about whether different kinds of crimes work differently on different parts of the population. So are some individuals more motivated by concern for others? Are other individuals more motivated for sort of self-protection and self-related safety concerns? And then beyond that, again, echoing what's been said, I think it's really interesting to think about shifting norms, both practical norms and moral norms, and how to navigate sort of different contexts in which different norms might emerge, and contexts in which different people assign different values to different moral principles.
Thank you, Liane. Thank you so much to all of you again for joining in on this conversation. I really appreciate it. I think we're going to have some interesting things to dive into just based on what each of you have already observed. I want to turn back as a starting point to hearing from Bengt a bit. Bengt and Rick have both been interested in this Swedish approach to the pandemic and sort of the moral underpinnings of that. I am not terribly familiar with the Swedish approach. I've read a little bit about it, but for listeners who aren't familiar, Bengt, can you go ahead and tell us how Sweden has been approaching the pandemic and sheltering and so forth?
All right, I do my best. It might be tricky. But the Swedish approach is characterized by, there's been no lockdown, right, at all. There has been restrictions of the kind that, not more than 50 people are allowed to gather. High schools and universities have been told to sort of work from a distance and teach at a distance. But, basically society has been pretty open. And also this also has political underpinnings because in distinction from some other countries, we don't have in our constitution the possibility to be too draconic in our measures. And another feature that is sort of political, good to know about the background, is that some of the authorities, there's a tradition in Sweden, politicians listen to authorities and to, in this case, the public health authority, for example, and they pretty much follow their advice. So, but anyway, the Swedish approach is sort of characterized by a lot of voluntariness. People are asked to keep the distancing, and we're asked to stay home when we feel sick, and and especially everyone above 70 are also asked to keep a very large physical distance to others. And moreover, there's been other measures taken as well. For example, the reason why the per capita count is so high in Sweden compared to other countries is that the homes of the care for the elderly, almost half of the 4,500 that's been dying in Sweden has been in those homes. And that has little or nothing to do with the general strategy of Sweden. But it is related to 10 years of sort of dismantling these institutions. So, some of them have been privatized, and so I'll give you an example. Even though really early in the pandemic, people were prohibited to visit. All visitors were prohibited in these homes. Many of the workers in these homes, they work on hours. They don't have permanent positions with educations and so forth. They work on hours. So they are probably, if they feel a little sick, they're probably not staying at home. They probably go to work anyway because they know that otherwise there'll be economic hardship waiting around the corner. So there's a lot of structural issues around that area of the the care system, I think. I don't know if I was at all clear about this. So maybe you have a follow-up question or something?
Yeah, so I just wanted to get a general sense for what's going on. So it sounds like there have been some limitations on how many people can be gathered together, but generally speaking, Sweden is open. And you're saying a lot of that is drawn from sort of this political backdrop of kind of deferring to authorities and so forth.
It's politicians deferring to authorities, but there's also, of course, we also have a very high level of vertical and horizontal trust in this country. So people tend to trust most of the authorities and follow their advice and their recommendations.
Okay.
So that's been another part of this. So for example, even though many Swedish people endorse this strategy, we wouldn't dream of exporting it to another country with another culture. So I've been hurting every time I've seen the attempts to hijack the Swedish strategy in culture, that everything would totally go wrong if they adopted it. So for example, parts of the US.
Rick, why don't you go ahead and I see you have your hand up there.
Yeah, so Bengt has raised a whole bunch of fascinating issues. First of all, I would point out that it seems to me that the health authorities in the United States and the UK had the same relationship to the politicians as was just described in Sweden, even though in Sweden there may be a formalization of the deference of the politicians to the health authority. In fact, the health authorities in England turned around Boris Johnson's approach, which was something like a no lockdown Swedish approach. And in the United States, we had health authorities who I think essentially were seen as heroes, and they were deferred to by politicians who couldn't take risks because they were politicians. So I don't think there's all that much difference actually in the relationship of politicians to health authorities across these societies. And I guess, and I am pulling for, and I am a fan of the Swedish approach, I guess I'm a little more willing to think that there are aspects of what happened in Sweden which could happen in the United States. In particular, for example, and I in fact heard the former director of the Swedish Health Authority say that he really thinks closing schools is a mistake, and he wasn't just talking about Sweden. And it seems to me there are reasons that have very little to do with culture for thinking it was a policy disaster to close the schools. One reason is what we know about the effect of being infected on children, which is quite minor. Secondly, there's good evidence out of Iceland and other places that young children in primary and secondary school do not spread the disease to adults. It seems to me if you're really just following the science and thinking about what the consequences would be of closing the schools, and those consequences are not just true in Sweden, it affects the capacity of health workers in all societies to go to work. It creates the inequalities that have been referred to as well. So I think that there is good reason to not just limit this, see the Swedish response as totally parochial with no lessons for others. I also think that I'm guessing, not totally naively, that a fair number of health workers, the people who were working in those nursing homes and care facilities in Sweden, came from probably immigrant minority populations. The Somali population in Sweden, in Stockholm, certainly has a higher infection rate, and that may follow from simply the cultural, first of all, their risk assessment, but also perhaps living in households where there were going to be intergenerational context. Don't go near your grandparents was sort of one of the pieces of advice that was out there, probably hard to do. There may have been customary patterns of sociality, which people were not willing to give up, just like teenagers who wanted to go to the beach and did so anyway, which may have, I suppose, had been one of the paths of infiltration into those nursing homes. So there are a whole set of issues, but in general, it seems to me what Sweden did was not have a lockdown, but leave it up to people to do social distancing. Many people decided to stop traveling on public transportation in Sweden. They did not close down the stores or the businesses, the business world. Their economy is still going to be affected because a lot of people didn't shop who would have shopped, but they could shop if they wanted to, and if they could go to a restaurant if they wanted to, under certain sensible rules of distancing. So basically, I'd like to argue that the draconian or severe lockdown policies, such as the one we had in the United States, should be viewed as a public policy disaster, and that at least what happened in Sweden didn't make things worse, and it allowed for a lot of normal social life and the economy to go forward. And to me, that in and of itself is a plus.
Okay, let's go in order here. So Brad.
Okay. No, this is really interesting. I guess one thing I was going to add I mean, I'm sympathetic that obviously, at least in hindsight, we might we might wish people made different policy decisions. But one of the things I also wanted to bring up here that came up in the first part of this was about compliance. And so that's one thing. Another thing is I'd be interested in adding, if people have things to say about Asia, broadly speaking. And so one thing I noticed is that there's a range of interventions. So you could have maybe the Swedish model looks like less restrictive. Then you have the United States and other countries, you know, and as Rick mentioned, the UK sort of deciding between more or less restrictive policies. And then, for example, just anecdotally, one of my friends in China that teaches in China told me that at one point when he was on lockdown, if you went outside, there were drones flying around in the air that would yell at you and broadcast a message telling you to go back inside. So there's a variety of strengths of government intervention that include well beyond what's in the US. But so that's one thing I think is interesting to bring up. The other thing is about compliance. And so I kind of wonder what people think about this. I mean, so one thought, I've had some people, you know, there's a caricature, Americans in general are pretty unruly. We don't follow rules. We're not good at following rules even when we want to. We buck against authority. So there's a sort of caricature of the individualistic American. And then some people have said, well, the Swedish model might work better somewhere like Sweden, where people are just, you know, they're either just more reasonable or better at following self-interest, or they're more willing to defer to legitimate authorities. So there might be sort of, and I don't know if we can make those big generalizations or how useful they are, but I'm sort of interested in that. And I've had friends who work in, say, like I have a friend who works in Hong Kong who's mentioned the idea that people in Hong Kong, they just seem a lot more reasonable about when the government says social distance in this way, people do it. And they say, you should all wear masks. People start wearing masks. Whereas in the United States, you know, I even see this in my local town, which is a very liberal, generally, I think was on board with the restrictions. It wasn't even officially removing this, the shelter in place, just when there was sort of talk of it loosening, people stop wearing masks, people really start going in a different direction. So those are the two things I thought I'd throw out there would be one, you know, looking at the Asian cases, but also the kind of question of how compliant are the citizens going to be? And one last thing Brent mentioned, you know, I think part of that could be the costs of compliance for some people. So sometimes some people might just choose not to, which was mentioned, the kids going to the beach. Then there are people who financially, it's hard for them to not go to work when they're sick, and that's connected to us not having a social support system. So those are some thoughts I had that maybe just to kind of continue this.
Yeah, thank you. And Bengt?
Yes, I have some comments, especially to Rick. Okay, Rick, I'm very impressed by your knowledge of Sweden and Swedish strategy, but there are some comments I want to make. I think I totally agree with you about everything you said, almost everything you said. Like the shutting down of schools seems to be totally ineffective. And but there are, when I said that parts of the Swedish strategy might not be exportable, what I had in mind was the bars and restaurants and gyms and stores and everything, because you know, I've been going to bars, restaurants, gyms, stores all the time during this pandemic, and I think this is only possible. It's not just possible because you're compliant, because you're a stupid sheep that follows recommendations, sort of, you know, keeping 2 meters of distance. It's also because there is a certain understanding on the behalf of the population of how the spread works. So, for example, when I go to gyms, you know, I always go those times of the day when there's least people there. When I go to a bar, if I see it's too crowded and I cannot have my 3 meters or whatever, I go to a different bar, which is less crowded. So you can see how neatly this has been self-regulating in all these areas. But there's also the other side. Now that we had really beautiful summer weather the last couple of weeks, you could see how especially young people would cram into outdoor cafes and restaurants, and that's been sort of a little disturbing. So it's all dependent on the population, or most of the population having a sort of understanding. So we also have another side of this understanding is that we most of us understand that masks is no use. So I don't see any mask in Sweden, for example. But so there is this compliance on the one hand, and there is fuck masks on the other hand. But it's all based on a certain type of understanding about how the virus spreads.
Yeah, Deb.
Well, I guess I just want to chime in and say that the knowledge of the virus and this understanding, I'm not taking you to say that it's limited to the Swedish population. I just want to argue that I think that most humans have a really good disease psychology, and so this understanding is actually pretty much in every human mind in terms of contagion and staying away from disease. The only problem really is in terms of the presence of cues of disease. So in the absence of cues that the mind evolved to use in order to assess the probability of contagion, that's really not present. I mean, you're not around people who might look sick, who are coughing, who have, gunk coming out of their eyes. Like, it's just not, the cues are not present. And so, the question is of what kind of information is being spread about how contagious this is. And I think that, across all humans, that's going to feed into a psychology that's then going to determine risk and trade-offs of, is it worth interacting with this person, hugging this tree, or what have you. And so I guess I just want to argue for the fact that, we're all Swedish in this way, in the sense of we all have a pretty good understanding of disease psychology. And so it couldn't just be that separates the Swedish method from the success of the Swedish method. Mm-hmm. I guess I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, Bengt, do you have a quick reply to that?
Yes, I do. I just have an anecdotal reply. I have some very good friends in New York that I've been talking to a lot during this pandemic, and some of the measures they have taken indicates that their high education and their rationality has gone totally out the window. So one friend of mine, she's wiping all the groceries when she's coming home after having been in the store, and other people I know, they've been making their own masks out of cloth, which will be wet in about 2 minutes, and they use it even if they walk around outside with more than 10 meters or 20 meters to the next person. So I think that's a pretty good sign that not everyone is sort of rational about these things. We might have all have good knowledge of disease psychology, whatever that is, but to have the actual mechanism of how this spreads, which makes you take precautions in some cases, but not all types of precautions. Because another example is I've seen on TV that in some countries, just for show, they sort of disinfect the whole city. Yeah. That seems to me totally ridiculous too, and it shows sort of a lack of understanding of the mechanisms by which the virus spreads. That's all I meant.
Liane?
Yeah, this is a really interesting conversation. I think just in response to the last couple of points, I feel like, what we could be saying is that if everyone had access to the same set of facts, we would all be behaving similarly. So one reason why Americans have wiped down groceries or made their own masks from bandanas is that they just have different access to different facts, right? So CDC puts out some set of recommendations and we follow them. And if they recommended differently, then we would behave differently. So I guess that's one issue. And I guess an issue there is that the facts seem to still be emerging. We can all agree that there is some fact of the matter about disease mechanism and all of these questions that we're considering, right? Like what infection looks like in children, how useful masks are, and so on. But I guess I feel like it's not clear what all those answers are yet. And so it seems like different people or different populations might just have different thresholds for risk. And so because of that, it seems like even if everyone did have the same access to facts, there are still different kinds of trade-offs that people are going to be making, right? So it's interesting when Ben started the anecdote about irrational people wiping down the groceries, I thought he was going to go in a completely different direction, which is that, you know, I have friends and colleagues who are otherwise very reasonable, but who are ready to, you know, travel elsewhere and forget about social distancing because of, you know, quarantine fatigue. So I guess that just goes to show that people can have really different priors, I guess, maybe depending on the kind of access to information that they have about risk and, you know, how to mitigate risk and how to navigate these trade-offs and so on. So I don't know. I think it's going to be really tough to find a solution for that reason, because we're facing these two really hard problems of what the facts are, and then also once we have all the same facts, you know, how to navigate these different trade-offs.
Yeah, and I wonder, Rick, do you want to respond to that?
Okay, so I was going to say this has been a fascinating conversation on this topic, and I think the question of understanding of how the virus spreads and what its implications are is a terribly important one. At one level, just to get back to something that was raised earlier by Bengt, if one's willing to grant that Boris Johnson ended up deferring to Ferguson, and in the United States, the politicians deferred to Fauci, and in Sweden, they deferred to, is it pronounced Tegnell? But in any case, there's still the question of why did the Swedish health authorities have such a very different picture of how the virus spreads and how to respond to it than did the experts in other countries. And, you know, if you look there, you know, there's an interview I saw called "Which Epidemiologist Do You Trust?" So even the epidemiologists have vastly different pictures of spread here, which go all the way from some who believe that this virus was everywhere long before we knew it in the world. Vast numbers have been infected by it. Vast numbers have been asymptomatic. Vast numbers have had cross-immune responses, which don't even leave specific antibodies, but they've had exposure to it and been infected. And others who say, well, wait a minute, you know, I think it's only 1% of the population or 5% of the population. And then there are arguments about how far has Stockholm gone and getting herd immunity and so forth. So the experts are all over the place. And I do think our risk assessment is wildly off with regard to once you activate the contagion response. I mean, the likelihood of death for someone who's healthy and under 50 is 1 in 50,000, okay? I have in front of me right now on my screen the 10 leading causes of death by age group in the United States. And if you're less than 65, you're much more likely to die of an unintentional injury like an automobile accident than from this virus. Nevertheless, vast numbers of people I know think they're going to die, and they've been running their lives that way with enormous amounts of fear. And they have been wiping down their groceries and doing all sorts of things based on a wildly inaccurate risk assessment. Same thing happens with regard to contagion within the household. I have two friends married to each other in their 70s. One of them ended up being infected, was quite sick for at least a month, probably longer, with severe flu-like symptoms. Her husband was with her alone in an apartment for that whole time, caring for her, has shown no symptoms. And when I finally looked into what the data is, it looks like maybe 15% of people who are in a household with someone who's been infected get infected themselves, which I suspect is much lower than most people would estimate. So I think that, you know, we're dealing with a system that actually is wildly off, which was one of the reasons I said that our moral intuitions and the instinct we have with regard to contagion, I don't think really serves us very well under these circumstances.
Yeah, thank you. I'm
But
wondering.
Bengt, why do you think the Swedish experts, your health authority, ended up having such a different picture than did, let's say, the experts in England or the United States?
I can only guess, Rick, but I think that it seems to me that they're very sort of, I don't know, the British policy seems to have been based a lot on one study.
Right.
Whereas the Swedish authorities, Tegnell, for example, he refers to all the studies that has been made so far. So, for example, when the issue of masks are coming up, he knows all the studies and his team. So he knows that there's one study that might, it might give you some reason to believe that masks can be effective in some spaces if it doesn't decrease the likelihood of getting infected, but it decreases likelihood of infecting someone else, for example. There's been one study showing that, and there's been another 20 showing nothing at all. And he's doing this every day at 2:00. He's standing there and talking about these studies on public TV, so we can all sort of follow this. But why this assessment? I think also that Tegnell has been taught by Giesecke. Giesecke is probably the guy you referred to before.
Yes, it was Johann Giesecke.
Johann Giesecke, and he's a very cool guy. But he's taking a sort of public health perspective. You can see that, right? Which means that he would do exactly the type of reasoning that he would use the same kind of reason that you used. You were talking about probabilities before, right? 1 in 50,000, 1 in this and that. This is the way public health works and always worked. But there are going to be some victims of this. A few anonymous deaths will result of this, but from a public health perspective, they sort of take the whole picture. So I think that might be one reason, that this preoccupation with, death counts and is not as strong in the public health. I mean, also in public health, if I can make another parallel to health economics, you probably know that in health economics, they're not very concerned with the number of deaths, or even premature deaths. They're concerned with the number of quality adjusted life years saved. So that might be another reason why they've taken this approach. They're thinking about life years, or as I argue in one of my articles, they should think about life years at least, because I think that's the currency that we need in order to compare different policies and their long-term consequences.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that your set of moral values in the first place sort of grounds you on what sorts of risks you are willing and not willing to take. And I'm wondering, Liane, I saw your hand up there, if you or Deb, both of you doing research with disgust, if earlier in the conversation, Rick and Bengt were talking about just how we might, and Liane, you had mentioned we have potentially access to different facts, but we also have access to different moral values that might be shifting what seems like relevant information for a given population. Anyway, Liane, I don't know if you want to respond to what I just said or if there was something else you had to say.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different aspects of this conversation that I find really interesting. So, I mean, speaking to the role of purity and disgust, although Deb is really the expert here, I find it fascinating that moral psychology has shown and social psychology has shown that conservatives on average tend to be more focused on disgust-related values, purity-related values than do say liberals. And yet when it comes to pandemic related issues, we're seeing exactly the opposite pattern, at least in our country. And the reason why I had my hand up after Rick made his point was, or actually after Bengt made his point, was to ask sort of the opposite question that Rick had asked, which is not why Swedish officials came to their recommendation, but really why American officials are coming to theirs. And I think, you know, the statistics that Rick is sharing are really striking, particularly, you know, that 1 in 50,000 statistic for people under 50. And so I feel like in general, we're pretty reasonable about our statistics and not focusing on absolute numbers when it comes to other diseases like the flu, for instance. And I know many people have compared flu to COVID. And so I'm wondering whether people think there is some kind of motivated reasoning going on here behind the scenes that is occurring in particular for liberals as opposed to conservatives, that is, you know, overcoming even the liberal tendency to downplay purity related concerns or contagion related issues. So I'm really curious, because this seems to be a situation in which I find myself certainly showing some kind of herd mentality, and that the liberal view, again, at least in America, tends to be maybe a little bit more cautious in this case than the conservative view. And I find myself sort of reading the liberal leaning articles that, again, maybe are advocating for more cautious approaches and risk averse approaches, again, specific to the context of coronavirus. And I admit that I don't have access to the kinds of numbers that Rick shared. And so, again, I'm interested to know what people think is going on in terms of both, you know, the psychology of the experts and also how people are receiving that information.
Yeah, let's, there's a few hands up. I'm just going to go in order here. Brad?
Okay, so a couple things. Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff has come up. One thing I think is there's some factual questions that there's dispute about. And there's also a question about what kinds of information was available to, say, policymakers at different points in time. So, but I guess on top of questions about what kind of information is available or what the facts are about the disease, I think this other thing that's come up that's interesting is about how does access to that information play a role in people's decision making. And so you can ask that about policymakers or groups of people or individuals. But I really want to emphasize the thing about, you know, we have to think about the moral considerations that are in play too. So it's not enough just to get people information. One thing that motivates a lot of people's behavior might just be, especially I imagine if your contagion response is provoked, I would assume, and I'd be interested to hear the psychologist say something about this, my sort of assumption is that your contagion response probably is connected to your self-preservation psychology. And it's not clear to me that, you know, so it might be more prudential, self-interested motivations that are going to be driving people's behavior. And it's not clear really that they might be, say, following their government says you should follow policy X, whether it's a good policy or not. People might follow that just because they're afraid of getting the disease and dying. And then we can get into a question, is that fear rational or not, with the issues people have brought up. But I guess my point is, that's not a moral motivation. That's just self-preservation. And so I think one of the questions is, you know, what are the moral considerations that individuals and groups need to worry about here? And are those things being brought to bear? And one thing I've noticed is a lot of these leaders in different countries, they adopt different policies. Like look at our conversation right here. It's all about the epidemiology. It's all about the facts. And so I think, you know, Brent mentioned this, but I think we should bring up there are moral value decisions that are being made, you know, if you hold the facts neutral. Or I guess some people brought that up. So I guess I just think we should start talking about that dimension of it, the sort of the more specifically moral dimension of it too. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you. And Deb, I saw your hand go up and then down. Did you want to respond to what Brad was saying with respect to hearing from psychologists about some of those moral value trade-offs?
Well, I guess I would so Brad, can you maybe clarify your question a little bit so I know where to jump in?
Sure. I guess my thought was, I mean, one thing that was really interesting to me about this whole conversation is the mention of something like the disgust module, and that's connected to maybe this idea of purity being a more dominant motive in certain cultures. And
Yeah,
I was
I'm
sort of
not.
wondering, is that really triggering moral? I mean, that might be a moral matter, but I'm thinking like my disgust response when I'm like, oh, there's a spider, gross, I want to back away, or like, oh, this looks like I'm going to catch COVID, I'm going to wear a mask.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about self-preservation. I'm not thinking about anybody else. It's not moral. It's just self-interest. So I was thinking, is that right, that the disgust reaction is largely a self-interested motivation and not necessarily really that connected to moral
Well,
thinking?
so I would argue, so yes, disgust is in the sense that you're saying kind of this self-interested, but something perhaps we can discuss later. I don't think that the moral response is any less self-interested for various reasons, but the idea that, you know, disgust really is an emotion that like very narrow, I mean, it's very general, and no, I don't want to say the word general. It covers a lot of terrain in the sense that it guides decision-making and behavior across, you know, what to eat, what to touch, and with whom to have sex. And by virtue of all of those systems, now you have ready to offer to a moral kind of psychology value across food, contact, and sex. And the moral system and our moral kind of coalitional psychology takes this and runs with it in various ways. And so to me, disgust definitely is one of those emotions that's taken advantage of by our moral system to communicate and to coordinate people in a particular direction. But I also see it as doing so for quote unquote self-interested reasons. But let me leave that there, only because I don't want to derail the conversation that we were just having.
Bengt, go ahead.
Yes. First, a minor thing on the Swedish sort of public health authority and the what's behind it. I also think it's good to know that there used to be an infectious disease authority that were put together with other authorities to form the public health authority, and you can see that they're also deeply concerned about other public health issues that has been actualized by this pandemic. So, for example, they sometimes tell people to go out and to move and to get exercise and you know, counteract loneliness, and they're concerned about violence in the family and so on. So that's just good to know. But I have a comment on moral motivation because I've been thinking a lot about that, and I think that Brad is right that many people, it's interesting, for most of us who are not healthcare workers or potential healthcare workers, you know, we cannot do very much actively to help out. You know, all we can do is to offer to buy groceries for neighbors over 70 or something. So most of us can only contribute by staying put and being and being passive and do nothing. So why do we do that? I mean, we can do it out of self-preservation. We could also do it not to expose specific others to risk. But what I find most intriguing is actually the collective end sort of motivation. You know, it's been emphasized so much in this country, and I wrote a piece on this when I sort of compared corona ethics to flu ethics. You know, when it comes to the flu, you can argue that in a liberal society, you know, you're free to expose yourself to risk if you want to. You're free to expose others to risk if they give informed consent to the whole thing. But in this pandemic, you're not free to do that because that might overwhelm the healthcare system. So there is this additional motivation. That's even if you think that, you know, I'm not going to get very sick if I get it. and so forth. An additional reason that we seldom see outside of climate ethics, for example, is that there's this idea that there is this collective end that we together should deal with the problem, and an important part of that is to keep the curve below what the healthcare system can do. So even if we, on an individual level, expose ourselves and others to risk, they're totally fine with it. What we do might be detrimental to these collective ends. And I find that a very interesting kind of moral motivation that is rarely actualized.
Yeah. And Rick, you've had your hand up for a while, and I'm sure you can respond to Bengt's recent comment as well.
Yeah, there are so many comments out there that one wants to respond to, and they're also fascinating. So as I don't know whether others are familiar with the big three of morality, which is a framework for trying to understand comparative ethics that I, along with several of my students and colleagues, have developed over the years. I think the reference to purity may be coming from John Haidt's formulation, which is a variation on the big three. I call it the ethics of divinity. And the big three end up being the ethics of autonomy, the ethics of community, and the ethics of divinity, each tied to a different conception of the self and to particular goods or values. So I think initially the temptation is to see the moral reactions here largely based on an ethics of autonomy, where some kind of harm, rights, and justice end up being the big values in the ethics of autonomy. And concerns about both harm to self and harm to others seems to dominate much of the conversation. But then if you start thinking about the logic of herd immunity and even the logic of the situation, it's not part of the false moral consciousness that I think goes on in this pandemic is people thinking that the one thing you have to do is slow down the curve, lower the curve. And that, it seems to me, is a big mistake, because part of the point is to steepen the curve for everybody who can get the infection without going to a hospital or making a demand upon the healthcare system. And if you simply slow it down, all you're doing is deferring things. You're not getting rid of the virus. You're not going to have fewer deaths in the long run. Ultimately, you're going to have the same number. You're just going to be putting it off. So it seems to me the logic of the situation is steepen the curve for the vast majority of the people who can get infected and recover without making big demands on that health collective system. And that is for a ethics of community goal, which is to protect the vulnerable who can't afford to get infected. And it seems to me there's also actually, in a curious way, an ethics of divinity or ethics of purity, if you want to call it that aspect. I mean, cleanliness is next to godliness. Look at the amount of time people are spending washing themselves these days. And look at the withdrawal from life, which is sort of reminds me of the ascetics of India, who are trying to get out of the world. So there are curious resonances to it. I think that unanalyzed, as far as at least what I read, I haven't yet seen anyone present data on what protecting that healthcare system has really done for the overall outcome. I think 90% of people who are put on ventilators in New York City died. And it's not as though there's a great therapy available when you get there. So it would be nice to see what is the marginal benefit of actually going to a hospital. And I don't know the answer to that, and I'm struck at how little it's been addressed. We just assume we have to protect the healthcare system, but how good is the healthcare system going to be at protecting us? Do we really have comparative studies showing people who elected not to go versus those who did go under similar symptomatic conditions? I don't think we have such evidence. With regard to motivated reasoning that I think Liane brought up, I think there are a lot of ironies. You pointed to one of them, that is all of a sudden this flip on the kinds of values that seem important to conservatives and liberals. But, I noticed others. I've been struck at how people I know, who I view as quite liberal and left, have developed a taste for authoritarian rulers. I mean, they want strong people giving them commands about what to do. And that to me is quite ironic. There's been very little attention to civil liberties issues throughout this whole thing. I suppose it's going to come up now because people that I know are very supportive of people going and demonstrating for social justice causes as a result of the recent horrors in the Minneapolis incident with George Floyd. But it's going to provide evidence. Are we really going to see a spike now in infection as a result of all of the people who went out to demonstrate in the last couple of weeks? We need to know that. It may well be that the social distancing situations we have are themselves exaggerated, and that people can participate in demonstrations the way they did without a huge increase in the spread of the disease. What else? There are a number of other issues that are out there. In any case, I think that in the background of this, from the motivated reasoning thing, of course, is the American political scene and attitudes towards our president and views people have of what's going to affect the next election, and taking seriously the recommendations and creating a sense of horror and fear and danger does have that at least political aspect to it, I think. And it's prepared in some ways by the kind of thinking that goes on about global warming, because apocalyptic thinking and the end of the world is coming thinking, which used to be something that evangelicals used to do with regard to end time thinking, and I suppose still do, has its secular liberal version, which is these apocalyptic pictures of the end of the world. And if you start thinking that way, this virus fits right into that particular kind of cognitive mapping, and I think was taken up with full force.
Liane?
Thanks, that was really helpful. I guess, again, I feel like there are two sets of questions, one about facts and then a second about what to do with the facts. And so I feel like I'm on less sure footing when it comes to the facts. For instance, what happens before patients go on ventilators? Does that make a difference? The fact that, healthcare systems are getting swamped and that's bad, not just because the system is getting swamped, but because people are dying. How many people are dying, given a flattened curve versus how many people dying in total there would be with a steeper curve. So those are questions that I don't have the answers to, but certainly the answers seem relevant, right? And then I guess the second question that doesn't have to do with the facts is what to do with the facts and why America happens to have the set of facts that it does. And so, Rick, you are alluding to motivated moral reasoning maybe driving some of the facts that we have. And I guess I'll just ask directly, is your feeling that it is the liberals who are hijacking the situation and trying to sort of direct the situation to a certain end? And is that sort of part of the irony that you are identifying? I guess I'm wondering this because you talk about how it's ironic that certain of your liberal friends are, now finding commanding leaders to be more appealing, but of course, only certain kinds of commanding leaders, right? And so I guess I'm still stuck on this question of why is it that, the liberals in our country, or just why does there seem to be this political division that is not intuitive, at least based on the social psychology literature that we already have? And so what is the role of both the experts and the people in shaping this conversation and about risk and the numbers and so on?
Well, I mean, look at the issue. You name the issue with regard to this pandemic, and there's going to be a politicization of it. So, for example, the mask discussion is going to divide the liberals from the conservatives. If you talk about what's happening to the economy, okay, and whether or not, when you think about the costs involved, you should take into account the damage done to the economy, the liberal formulation ends up being life versus money, Okay, how can you pick, money over life? And there's a kind of reluctance to imagine well-being in a broad sense and thinking about the costs along multiple dimensions. That is sort of blocked by the very spin that gets put on it in the first place. I actually think, this may sound extreme, but I actually know people, and I think this is more broadly than the people I know, who actually were not so sad that the stock market went down and went down radically, because they thought that Trump was gaining an advantage by the stock market being so high, and that would be a point in his favor during the election. So they were actually sort of hoping that this thing will extend long enough so that the stock market won't recover before the election occurs. I mean, it's like again and again and again, anything you might mention ends up being seen through the lens of the next election and how you feel about Donald Trump. Now, it's also the fact that at least in the United States, if you went to a blue state, you had governors who were acting to lock things down. And at least as a generalization, if you went to red states, that was less likely to occur. The red states wanted to get out of this more quickly than the blue states. It's also the fact, of course, that the blue states probably suffered more with regard to the outcomes of the virus. New York State, I mean, let's compare Sweden to New York State. I know if you're a Swede, it matters to you a lot and to your sense of self-esteem what's happening in the other 3 Nordic countries. And the fact that Swedes now are being treated differently within Europe and not allowed to travel into some countries, whereas if you're a Finn or if you're a Dane, you have much more mobility. All that is very wounding to one's sense of national pride. But there are 10 million plus people in Sweden. There are 19 million plus people in New York State. New York State, which locked down, has close to 3 times the deaths of Sweden, even though Sweden has many more than those other Nordic countries. I mean, just compare that. You can pick your comparisons. And right now we're in a world in which you can make any argument and find some comparison to make. The facts, as you're pointing to, are really poorly understood. We've actually seen the soft side of hard data, and the ability to, the old notion of how to lie with statistics is, it's rampant right now. There's non-comparability with almost every measure that's out there. People don't even count deaths in the same way with the attribution of whether it was caused or not caused by the virus. And it's a very hard thing to do. A large percent of the people who are dying were at death's door, before this came along. And it's like the straw that made the difference, broke the camel's back. That's why it's very important to have the measure that Bengt was talking about and not simply number of deaths. So the whole thing is a mess with regard to evidence. We're not going to really know about it, what conclusions to draw on any of these things, including what the infection fertility rate is, for a long time, and if ever. So, the factual conversation, it leaves an enormous amount of room to pick your evidence, spin it the way you want, make the comparison you want, which is an invitation to motivated reasoning of the type you're talking about, because you know the outcome you want, and you can find the data to try and make the argument.
Yeah. All right. We're going to go Deb, then Bengt, and then we'll just do a couple of final thoughts and close out. We're already pushing time here. Deb, go ahead.
Well, I'll make this quick. I really just wanted to follow up on what Rick was saying, because I really, so I agree with a lot of what Rick just said. Trade-offs are critical, and I feel like we've totally lost all sense of this. Every time I hear about a lot of money going towards in one direction, I always think, and there's, kids who are homeless, who are starving, and how we could have fed them all. We could have educated them all. And so I do, I am, Milton Friedman was always fond of saying, this is a good measure, but you have to ask compared to what. And I've always appreciated, whenever I hear him in video and his writing say that. And so, when people do mention that a particular decision is important or good, I do find myself asking compared to what, and I feel like we have very much lost that. But anyway, I just wanted to say I enjoyed what you had to say, Rick, and I agree.
Thank you. Bengt?
Yeah, thank you, Rick, too, for all your splendid comments. It's just one that I want to pick up on. I want to pick up on all of them, actually, but one that I have time to pick up on. That's the, to me, it's deeply disturbing how nationalism, how nationalistic the whole sentiment around this epidemic is. And part of it is, of course, what you mentioned about the Nordic countries. You know, now some right-wing parties are trying to score points by making comparisons to other Nordic countries. But what I think that we're going to find out, if we haven't found it out already, is that regional differences are far more, as you suggest, Rick, far more interesting and far more important than national differences. And I don't even know to what extent all these national strategies have an effect. I mean, in Italy, you can see that Milan was severely hit. Rome was hardly hit at all, even though there was a lot of traffic between the two cities for a very long time. And in Sweden, you can see that Malmö, which is the third city, they have hardly no cases at all, even though, and they're next to Copenhagen and Denmark, and they're not allowed to travel to Denmark anyway. And you can see that there are parts of Sweden with very high incidence especially parts of Stockholm. And I think that we need to be a little more humble in general when it comes to evaluating all these things in terms of life saved or whatever. You know, I think we should look more at the other long-term consequences of different strategies and sort of upgrade the importance of this, because it will have severe consequences for the young generation and for the economy and so forth. And
yeah. Thank you, Bengt. All right, we're close to time here. I just want to open up the floor for anyone who has last comments or things to send listeners off thinking about.
Yeah, I've learned a lot. This has been really interesting. I guess one thing that's coming up in my mind at the end here is just a question of where in our society we have spaces, or what we need to do to have spaces where people could actually think about the trade-offs and the moral issues as individuals, but also as politicians and policymakers. So I think that's an interesting idea, that maybe that sort of decision making needs to take place at local levels, and especially if there are different communities with different, values or maybe dispositions to respond to the facts or policies. But I think one thing is you have to ask, where is the space in our society right now to have those discussions and have people trying to make those decisions in a thoughtful way. And so I think that's one thing I would leave, is just thinking about, I think, there's a lot of stuff about how polarization and the new populist movements and things like that. But I think another part of that is the kind of foreclosure of a public space. And, you look at the transformation of journalism into basically institution that sells attention of consumers. And so I think that's a whole other thing that it's good to think about, is that where do you find a space as an individual where you can try to think about this stuff and make these decisions and find the time to do it? And maybe people can work on doing that at an individual level. But I think that's just another issue I'd end by bringing up.
Thank
you. Can I add to that? Can I just add one thing to that, which is I completely agree with Brad that we need to do that. It's just, depending on the topic, that could be quite dangerous, right? Because suddenly now you are asking questions that, yes, are reasonable in terms of what to trade off, but it's unpopular in the sense of, it's not fitting very neatly into any one kind of political view, or it's a conflicting vision with what we currently see out there, either liberal or conservative or something like this. But so it's always good to look good, and so as soon as you start asking questions that deviate from your coalition in terms of saying, well, shouldn't we be thinking about this particular outcome? it's just dangerous. So having I agree. Where can we do this without risk to ourselves, but for the purpose of being able to, advance the greater good.
Yeah, thank you, Deb. Rick, we'll hear from you last, and then we'll close out.
Okay, so just a few quick points. One, I just wanted to clarify one thing, which is that when I was talking about the logic of the situation and steepening the curve, I want to make sure it's clear that I'm distinguishing between steepening the curve for those who are not vulnerable, who don't have comorbid conditions, who could get infected and recover without putting a demand on, without their life being threatened, without going to a hospital, and flattening the curve, of course, for those who are vulnerable. So you're trying to do both in an ideal kind of reaction or policy, which of course requires that you don't treat everyone as equal, which may be one of the reasons that politicians have a hard time doing that, because at least in the public realm, everyone's an equal citizen. So if you start saying the elderly who have comorbid conditions are going to be treated differently than the young who are healthy, that maybe creates problems that are political problems. But the logic of the situation is to start drawing distinctions and not saying we're all in this together and everyone should have the same rules and the same policies applied to them. I guess the final point I would make has to do with the kind of cognitive biases that I think have been massively on display. And one of them is illusion of control. And I think it's an entirely open question. I don't know the answer to it. We're going to need a lot better evidence. But I'd like to be persuaded that lockdowns worked in any sense. That do we really need them? Would the same outcome have occurred if we had left schools open and left businesses open? I guess the other cognitive bias there have been at least 2 studies, themselves, of course, disputed, but trying to show that in the United States, if you look across states in the United States, the timing of your lockdown, whether you did it early or whether you did it later, had no difference in outcome. And a similar kind of thing has been done cross-nationally by at least one investigator. They're tentative, but in any case, that issue has to be addressed. The other thing has to do with confirmation bias. And the way we have not really talked about the role of the media in all this. But it seems to me that the media, at least the media, some of the media, and a very influential media, decided to buy into a kind of narrative about health disaster is coming. And they were publishing again and again stuff to confirm that narrative, whether it was putting on display overwhelmed hospitals and piled up dead bodies in Italy, or whether it was telling you a detailed account of the 40-year-old who died, to somehow get you not to start thinking about how age-related all this was and how it was related to comorbid condition. So when you have a dramatic article about the 40-year-old healthy person who ended up in an ICU and then died, of course, that scares people like mad. But they're also essentially giving attention to atypical cases. And that is a kind of confirmation bias. I thought the same thing happened with the New York Times when they started at one point tentatively with Tom Hanks and his wife, who got infected in Australia. And there was for a day or two an account of them speaking about their experience, which ended up being a very benign experience. And I noticed that dropped out very quickly, as though if we start every day telling about people who got infected and didn't have a bad experience, well, that'll look unpatriotic. It'll look like we're somehow not taking this seriously. And they stopped doing it. But again, it's a kind of confirmation bias. And I think the ramping up of the fear and the panic, at least in part, was what can be attributed to the way the media covered the story.
Yeah, thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rick, Bengt, Brad, Debra, and Liane. Thank you to all of you. I really appreciate your willingness to take part in this conversation. I know that listeners are excited for this one coming out as well. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the coordination and working with me the past few weeks to get this squared away.
Thank you, and thank you all.
Thanks, Amber.
Very enjoyable conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Good to meet everybody.
Thanks for listening listening. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, or requests, contact me at www.moralsciencepodcast.com. The Moral Science Podcast is sponsored by ERA Inc., a research and design think tank that's reinventing how people interact with each other. Music throughout the program is My Kruby by Schwader and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.